Welcome everyone to the final session of what has been an absolutely riveting and thought-provoking few days. The session that we're about to hear about is called Intersections, Conspiracy and Extremism. And the first of our speakers are speaking to us from the University College London, Dr. Bettina Rottweiler and Professor Paul Gill. They're going to speak with us about the contingent relationship between conspiracy beliefs and violent extremist intentions. Really looking forward to this wonderful session, and please put any Q&A that you might have in the Q&A. Thank you. Over to you, Bettina and Paul Gill.
Sorry, I'm just going to share my slides. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay. And thank you for joining our presentation today. And thanks to the AVERT network for organizing and hosting this conference. Today I'm presenting Paul Gill's and my research on conspiracy beliefs and violent extremism. This is based in the Department of Security and Crime Science at UCL. And the studies presented today are part of the Grievance project, which is led by Paul. So our recent work is to examine the impacts of conspiratorial thinking on violent extremism, and more specifically to identify for what kinds of people or with what types of characteristics conspiratorial beliefs can have particularly adverse effects. Today looks at one part of that research question and examines the contingent effects on violence. We are witnessing the harmful.
Bettina, your audio keeps cutting in and out.
No?
Yeah, that's better, Bettina. That's much better.
Yeah, can you hear it better?
Yeah, it's much clearer. Yeah.
Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, so some of the most detrimental impacts we have seen recently was, for example, a series of right-wing terrorist attacks which occurred across the US, Europe, and New Zealand, and which demonstrated that extreme conspiratorial worldviews can mobilize individuals towards extremist violence. And we saw that the perpetrators heavily referenced far-right conspiracy theories such as the Great Replacement and white genocide. And we have also seen during the COVID-19 pandemic that extremist groups across the ideological spectrum have been propagating anti-government, anti-science, and anti-media conspiracy narratives for their own recruitment and propaganda strategies. And probably the most notable recent incidents, which really made clear that conspiracy narratives and disinformation strategies can indeed lead to real-world violence, was the US Capitol attack on January 6th. And so all these incidents kind of point to a functional role of conspiracy theories within violent extremism. Yet the empirical evidence base examining this intersection is still quite limited. What's also interesting and really important to mention here is that our own data from the UK and Germany show that belief in conspiracy theories is widely prevalent within the general population. And we also know at the same time that not everyone who endorses conspiracy theories is at risk of becoming radicalized. So our data further shows that in contrast to conspiracy beliefs, only a small % of people hold violent extremist intentions. And we know it's only then a fraction of those people who will eventually end up engaging in violence. So there need to be a lot of other factors involved which will influence the relationship between conspiracy thinking and violent extremism. So therefore, the first study, which I'm presenting today, looks at the interactive effects of individual differences and conspiracy beliefs on violent extremist intentions. And the analyses are based on a German nationally representative telephone survey, which Paul and I conducted in 2019, and which consists of 1,502 participants. So rather than suggesting a direct causal effect, we hypothesized that this relationship is likely dependent on a range of other factors, which in some cases may amplify or maybe also dampen the impacts of conspiratorial thinking on violent extremism. And more specifically, in the first study, we examined whether this relationship depends upon individual differences, such as varying levels of self-control, self-efficacy, and law-related morality. And we really expected that depending on these characteristics, people will vary widely in their susceptibility to violent extremism. And to put it simply, we hypothesized that certain people who have that combination, so people who believe in conspiracy theories and have certain personality characteristics, are much more vulnerable to violent extremism compared to those who only hold conspiracy beliefs. And to test this, we ran 3 separate interaction models, one with self-control, one with self-efficacy, and one with legal cynicism as the moderator. And yeah, so we used several validated scales to measure these constructs within our general population sample. And all of our scales were measured on 7-point item scales, where 1 meant I completely disagree and 7 meant I completely agree. And in order to measure violent extremist intentions, we assess participant willingness to engage in illegal and violent political action on behalf of a group with whom individuals prior identified most strongly with. And an example item is, I would participate in a public protest against the oppression of my group, even if I thought the protest might turn violent. So previous research has shown that conspiracy beliefs are largely determined by a general propensity towards conspiracy thinking, a so-called conspiracy mentality. So this renders people who believe in one conspiracy theory much more likely to also believe in other conspiracy theories. And in order to measure that conspiracy mentality, we asked, for example, participants how much they agreed to the following statements. There are secret organizations that greatly influence political decisions, or another one was, events which superficially seem to lack a connection are often the result of secret activities. Then self-efficacy was measured with 6 items, and it refers to beliefs that one can successfully perform an action. And an example item is, if someone opposes me, I can find means and ways to get what I want. Then our measure of self-control taps into the constructs of impulsivity, risk-taking, and thrill-seeking. And an example item is, when I'm really angry, people better stay away from me. And then lastly, legal cynicism can be described as a mechanism which leads to the disengagement from internal obligation to comply with the law, rules, or social norms. And an example item is, sometimes it's necessary to ignore rules and laws and to do what you want. On this slide now, you can see the correlations between all measures in our first study, and you can see the means and standard deviations. The mean for conspiracy theory belief was 4.33, and the mean for violent extremist intentions was 1.60. And about 8% of people somewhat agreed, or fully agreed to the violent extremist intention items. Yeah, and violent extremist intentions showed the strongest correlation with legal cynicism, and the same we saw for conspiratorial thinking, which also shared the strongest correlation with legal cynicism. So let's turn to the moderation analysis. So if we look at our first model, we expect that individuals who hold strong conspiracy beliefs and at the same time hold strong self-efficacy beliefs will show more violent extremist intentions. And if we look at the results, we can see that stronger conspiracy beliefs lead indeed to increased violent intentions. However, we also see that this relationship is dependent on levels of self-efficacy, which is indicated by the statistically significant interaction term, which you can see highlighted on the right side. And if we look at the plot, we can see that when self-efficacy is high, so it's the top blue line, then conspiracy beliefs have strong effects on violent and extremist intentions. However, we also see that these effects are diminished when self-efficacy is average, and even weaker when self-efficacy beliefs are low, which is the light blue line. So our results suggest that those individuals who score highly in both, so conspiracy belief and self-efficacy beliefs at the same time, may feel more capable of taking violent action in order to redress their grievances. Our second moderation analysis looks at the effects of self-control, and we expected that the effects of conspiracy beliefs on violent extremism are contingent on individuals' capacity for self-control. Yeah, and if we look at the results, the second conditional analysis reveals that conspiracy beliefs do affect violent extremist intentions, particularly when individuals have low self-control. So you can see the top blue line. On the other hand, when individuals have high self-control, the effects of conspiracy beliefs are much influential. You can see that with the light blue line at the bottom. So therefore, we argue that self-control in that relationship can be defined as an interactive protective factor, which lessens the adverse effects of conspiracy beliefs. So the third analysis looked at low relative morality, and we expected that higher levels of legal cynicism will increase the effects. And if we look at our results, we can see that conspiracy beliefs particularly affect extremist intentions when legal cynicism is high. So that's again the top blue line. And this effect is much weaker for individuals with average levels of legal cynicism. And importantly, what we can see with the bottom line is that when legal cynicism is low, the relationship even becomes negative. However, that bottom line wasn't statistically significant. So therefore, a high low relative morality may act as before, like with self-control, as an interactive protective factor. So after we looked now at the individual level factors, which we have seen amplify the effects of conspiracy thinking on violent extremism, we decided to further analyze the interactive effects of group and social environmental factors and see how they interact with conspiracy thinking. And therefore, in the second study, we examined whether the effects of conspiracy beliefs on violent extremist intentions are dependent on whether people perceive threats to their in-group, whether they have delinquent peers or friends, and whether they're exposed to peers who hold extremist beliefs. And to measure exposure to extremist peers, participants were asked to indicate how much they think their friends agree to several items. And one was, for example, it's sometimes necessary to use violence, commit attacks, or kidnap people to fight for a better world. And to measure association with extremist peers, respondents were asked to indicate if their friends committed different types of violent and non-violent crimes. And an example item was, have your friends ever broken into a car or a building? And perceived group threats was measured with, for example, I feel the group I belong to is under threat. On this slide now, it shows again the mean standard deviation intercorrelations between all variables used in study 2. And violent extremist intentions showed the strongest correlation with exposure to extremist peers, whereas conspiratorial thinking demonstrated the strongest relationship with perceived threats. And if we look at our first interaction model of the second study, we expected that the effects of conspiracy beliefs would be dependent on individuals' association with extremist peers. And the findings of this first condition analysis shows that conspiracy beliefs affect violent extremist intentions, particularly when individuals are exposed to extremist peers. On the other hand, when individuals report less exposure to extremist peers, the risk effects are much weaker. And when they report that they don't have any extremist friends, stronger conspiracy beliefs are not associated with more violent extremist intentions. And similarly to high self-control and legal cynicism, not being exposed to peers who hold attitudes supportive of violent extremism may act as an interactive or buffering protective factor, which lessens, again, the adverse effects of conspiracy beliefs. So it's likely that those individuals probably have peer or friendship networks who hold pro-social and normative values, and therefore, despite holding conspiratorial beliefs, the risk for engagement in violent extremism is very low. The second analysis looks at the effects of delinquent peers, and we expected that association to delinquent peers would increase the effects of conspiracy beliefs. And if we look now at the plot, we can see that the effects of delinquent peers particularly affects violent intentions when individuals report to have delinquent peers, which you can see at the top blue line. However, we also see that this effect is much weaker for individuals who report to not have any delinquent friends. So none of their friends have engaged in criminal or violent behaviors, which is the bottom line. And lastly, the last analysis looked at whether perceived threats to the in-group would affect conspiracy beliefs. And we thought that depending on whether individuals perceive threats to their in-group, those individuals who additionally hold strong conspiracy beliefs would be more vulnerable to violent extremism. And the results show that when individuals perceive strong threats to the in-group, the effects of conspiracy beliefs are amplified. Yet we also see that the effects are diminished when in-group threats are average and even weaker when perceived threats are low. And the findings suggest that individuals who hold perceptions of threat to the in-group and who also hold strong conspiracy beliefs show a greater risk towards violent extremism. Yeah, and to conclude the presentation, so the results of study 1 confirmed that the effects of conspiracy thinking on violent extremist intentions are much stronger for individuals who have lower self-control, who score higher on legal cynicism, and who have stronger self-efficacy beliefs. Conversely, we also saw that when stronger conspiracy beliefs are held in combination with high self-control and strong law-related morality, violent intentions are lower. So it's actually in these circumstances that when a risk factor is present, that the value of a protective factor really becomes clear. And this might give important insights for PCV approaches. And if we look at the second study results, they showed that the effects of conspiracy beliefs are much stronger for individuals who perceive greater in-group threats and for those individuals who are exposed to extremist and delinquent peers. In contrast, what we also saw is that when individuals hold conspiratorial beliefs but don't have any friends with extremist beliefs, they hold a much lower risk towards violent extremism. Similarly, not having any delinquent friends seems to lessen the adverse effects of conspiracy beliefs. So as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, so we know from our own data that many people engage in conspiracy thinking, and which is why holding a so-called generic conspiracy mentality as well as the endorsement of specific conspiracy narratives on their own don't seem to be particularly good predictors to assess individuals' vulnerability to violent extremism. However, if conspiracy beliefs and certain individual, group, and social environmental factors are present, we can say at least that vulnerability towards violent extremism significantly increases. So in fact, it might be that certain individual differences might get us that tiny bit closer to understanding why certain individuals engage in violence, while others, for holding, for instance, similar conspiracy beliefs do not. And therefore, the takeaway message is that it's insufficient to purely focus on the independent effects of conspiracy narratives on violent extremism. Instead, we should really incorporate conditional and contextual factors. And really in order to capture a much more nuanced picture of that very complex relationship. So we also recommend much more research into the protective factors for conspiracy thinking, as well as for violent extremism. And as a final recommendation, we stress the need to implement evidence-based prevention and intervention programs in order to tackle the impacts of endorsement of conspiracy theories and to minimize vulnerability to violent extremism. Last point, so such programs should ideally build upon a robust empirical evidence base, which unfortunately we don't have yet, but we're working towards it. It's also important that these
You're actually
approaches...
Thank you, Bettina. We're at time. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Sure, that's fine.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Really love it.
Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's Dr. Daniela Pisoiu from the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. Daniela is going to speak with us about intersections between conspiracy theories and violent extremism in Austria and Germany. Over to you, Daniela.
Hi, I guess good afternoon, good morning here where I am. I'm really happy to be with you guys today. As already mentioned, I'm going to talk about the intersections between conspiracy theories and extremism. My presentation is a little bit more, or actually a lot more empirical than what we've seen before, but I think you can probably see some illustrations of the mechanisms that were presented. So in terms of intersections, I'm going to focus especially on the far right. And as you will see, the direction of the movement here is basically towards really empowerment of the far right, and how the far right has managed to occupy and instrumentalize what's been going on in the conspiracy theories scene, both in Germany and in Austria. I'm explaining this a little bit also along the lines of phenomena that were already ongoing on the one hand, but also by looking a little bit at their rhetorical strategies. And then in the end, I will look at this from a little bit different perspective. So the conspiracy theories themselves, and actually even new groups who have joined the area of extremism and who were actually not really in focus before. And this is really a new development, and we're still hypothesizing why this has been happening. So if we compare, for example, the far right and jihadism in Europe in general, we can see that the far right is really the big winner of the COVID pandemic in terms of number of sympathizers, presence, but also violent behavior. So I'm going to give you some numbers on these elements that I listed here. For example, so in terms of victims of terrorism, we've been used to having jihadi terrorism causing victims rather than the far right, but we've seen actually recently an increase in this area. So for example, 2020, one single right-wing terrorist attack in Germany killed 9 people. Whereas we've noticed, we actually have in Germany, we don't have it in Austria yet, but in Germany we have a yearly report of the Office of the Protection of the Constitution, and there you can see, among others, the numbers of how they say politically motivated crimes, violent crimes. So in 2020 in Germany, we've seen an increase of 5.1% in the far right field, and an absolute number of 23,604. Just to compare, in the left wing, there was an increase of only 2.8% and a total number of 9,849, so actually less than half And in the Islamist spectrum, there was actually a decrease of 4%, an absolute number of 409 offenses. Another increase has been, and that's really over the last 30 years, the increase in the right-wing extremist plots. And what is really, really worrying nowadays is the fact that the far right, which is really different to, for example, the jihadi scene, that far right actors have access to huge arsenals of weapons, and that they carry out on a regular basis paramilitary and survival training in preparation of the day X, as they call it. Actually, I had a discussion yesterday about accelerationism and the fact that, you know, this idea of causing civil war, which is already arriving in Europe as well. But the point is that the main idea of it is not really different. So it's really similar to the idea of this day X. So basically, people have been preparing for this over the decades. So this day X basically is when they will actually confront their enemies in the final battle and in their views, hopefully prevail. So overall, you can see that if you look at all these elements, the danger from the far right spectrum is actually even greater than the jihadi one, although if you look at the reports, it's not always particularly obvious. Another thing that has been going on for a while is the so-called mainstreaming of the far right. And here's a definition, which I think is quite adequate to say. So this is a process by which parties, actors, discourses, and attitudes move from marginal positions on the political spectrum or public sphere to more central ones, shifting what is deemed to be acceptable or legitimate in political media and public circles and contexts. So what we've seen basically is really a shift of the discourse from the extreme right towards the middle, whereas especially right-wing parties, mainstream right-wing parties have adopted the discourse, the concepts, the agenda of far-right parties. And this has been, of course, increased through the fact that you have a number of coalitions with right-wing and far-right parties in Europe. To give you an example of this, an illustration. So these are, perhaps you're familiar with them, the identitarian movement. They are present in a number of European countries, and they are the so-called new right. So in the US, one uses alt-right. There are some differences, but there are actually quite many parallels. In any case, so this new right movement is basically presenting itself as, so they distance themselves from neo-Nazis, and they say they are actually not adherents of that ideology anymore. Of course they are, but their presentation is less obvious. They use other terms, such as, for example, not race but culture, ethno-pluralism. So they say, you know, every people is allowed to live as long as they live in their country. They don't come to us, and so forth. So the point of showing you this is to say this is what they did in 2016, where this mainstreaming was not really there yet. And this was done in the middle of the night. This is a statue in the center of Vienna between two museums. This is the Empress Mary Teresa, and they dressed her up in a burqa to basically put a signal of how you know, how Islamism is already here and is a danger to the local culture. And what you see there written is Islamization, no thank you. So they have been basically using this concept of Islamization, of danger posed by Islam. And at the time, it was just seen as something weird, and basically they themselves did not have the courage to do it in broad daylight. They did it in the middle of the night because they knew there wasn't going to be much approval for what they did. This, however, changed. This is something that happened actually very recently. Maybe you guys are familiar with this term, political Islam. Political Islam as such usually refers to movements and ideologies that inspire themselves from religion, such as, for example, also Christian democratic parties. But in this context, political Islam is used to mean extremism, so Islamist extremism. This is one of the measures that was taken here in Austria to say, we are going to map all the Muslim organizations and mosques in the country and create this map. Now, of course, if you have this map here under the label of political Islam, i.e. extremism, then you have the impression, oh my God, there is extremism all over the place. So the country is full of extremist organizations. Of course, a very, very bad and wrong signal. But this having happened gave courage to the identitarians who shortly afterwards, I think it was the next day, went out and did this particular action. And it says here, attention, political Islam near you. And then more information, the Islam map. And they did this time in broad daylight. And they did it basically in front of various mosques, just regular mosques, not even radical of any kind. And yes, there was protest, but there was not much backlash. The government said, well, no, we do not support this. This is right-wing extremism. It is not what we mean. We actually want to protect Muslims and so forth, but it doesn't matter. In the end, the choice of words basically gave legitimacy to this far-right discourse. What else has the far-right been doing just in relation to the COVID pandemic? A number of things. So there were, and there still are, a number of disinformation narratives, such as, for example, the virus doesn't exist, that the virus is harmless, that the virus is not worse than the flu. The Great Reset has also been mentioned, especially by the identitarians, but also others. Great Reset is basically to say that the pandemic is there for the global conspiracy to finally control people all over the world through the chips, and through that, reduce world population. The idea of civil war was also mentioned, but not to that extent. And when I say the far right, I don't just refer here to the identitarians, but really the whole of it, including, for example, the far right party here in Austria, the FPÖ. And just to see the effects of it, for example, how these things actually work, because the question is, do they work at all, right? If you look at the geography of the country and where you have the highest number of vaccines and the lowest number of COVID cases, well, these are the regions where this particular party is not particularly strong. So you can see already some empirical effects of this. What else has been going on? Now I'm going more, I'm a little bit deeper in the idea of interaction and intersection between conspiracy theories and the far right. So one phenomenon has been for initial conspiracy groups to move towards the far right. So for example, the so-called Querdenker were initially a group merely protesting the measures, and actually more on an economic level of how, why these measures are not, well, negative and have negative effects on the economy. Now, this whole group has in the meantime joined the far right and basically also adapted to the far right ideology. This is a German group, but there's also a wing here in Austria. Here it says protection of the homeland instead of protection of the mouth, as in, because Mundschutz means mask also in German. This is another example. This is actually a very successful singer, a musician, songwriter, and he was before very active in the anti-racism movement. And at some point he switched and started to, and that it happened really with the so-called migration crisis around 2015, where he started to argue along the lines of the far-right discourse that the migration and the people who come, the refugees, are a danger to the home country. What has happened, however, even more, so he did another transition from this far-right only discourse towards conspiracy theory. So now he's a very ardent defender of QAnon and QAnon ideology. There is even a famous video of him on YouTube where he's basically crying, thinking about the children who are being abused by the elites. Another thing that we've seen during the during the pandemic is, and this is not very surprising, the fact that the various wings of the far right march together. So here, this is a, so it says here, this is a QAnon sympathizer at the demonstration, which was organized by the FPÖ, so by the far right party. And in the back, the individuals are actually identitarians. So you can see again the cooperation, another example of it, really. Another thing that has been observed, because over the months there have been a lot of demonstrations, and one phenomenon has been the so-called infiltration and radicalization of COVID demonstrations. So the far right infiltrating demonstrations with people that were not necessarily pertaining to this particular scene, but infiltrating them and kind of giving the direction of the discourse. And what the security agencies also say is that this has evolved even more towards radicalization, in the sense of radicalization towards violence. And we see here, for example, an effect of it. So this incident was, this is a petrol station where the shopkeeper was shot by a customer because the shopkeeper asked him to wear a mask. And the point of the matter is that it wasn't spontaneous, but so the man came and he was asked to put on a mask, didn't have one, went home, took a mask, put it on, came back in the shop, and then he took it off again when he wanted to pay. So the shopkeeper told him again he needs to wear the mask, at which point he basically shot him in the head. And this guy has been active on far-right conspiracy theories websites and forums and social media, but he was not necessarily a far-right person per se. So if at all, this individual was probably at the beginning of his radicalization process. And still this sudden transition to violence. Here, I just give some examples of the reaction on these on this online media to what has happened. And you see here that there was actually support for what he did. So understanding, oh yeah, okay, he was fed up, I can understand, I can relate. As long as it hits the right ones, no mercy. These people with the mask are annoying, serves them well, free your mind, now it's starting. So you already so you see this kind of mobilization and actually really surprising support for this act. Going further, these are illustrations of even more mixing. So far I showed conspiracy theories and the far right, but here, for example, you see a mix of the far right, so the Austrian Freedom Party, the FPÖ, identitarians, but also people waving rainbow flags, and of course also QAnon. And the surprise here was to see that you also had left-wing individuals and groups joining the demonstration of the far right. That was extremely surprising. Another example, this was in Austria, obviously. This one is in Germany. And again, the far right and the Querdenker, but also surprisingly, I guess, I'm not sure if it's, but I guess it's esotericists. So these are basically sympathizers or members of movements that look into alternative spiritual practices, starting with yoga to other things. And basically at this particular demonstration, there were meditation sessions and banners with love and life and freedom and such. And in the end, it ended up with violent escalation with the police. But I think what is even the more relevant aspect here is the fact that these individuals would have usually never dreamed of joining something with the far right have actually done this. Another example here, back to Austria, where you see it's really a mix. So they want peace, freedom, they want peace, and then there's some religious elements to it, like God, please protect us. But then we are the people, which is more kind of far right. We don't want dictatorship, freedom of expression, freedom of press. We oppose vaccines. And this was, again, a very mixed crowd with identitarians, neo-Nazis. Pegida is something more of a populist, but rather far right as well. Hooligans, QAnon, religious groups, and again, the esotericists. Perhaps I'm just going to stay with this slide. I think I have 2.5 minutes left. As I say, we don't really have a theory for why this has happened, but there are some hypotheses. So for example, some people say that there is actually an esoteric section of the far right, which leads back to National Socialism, and that a fixation on the natural or the search for spiritual purity can end up in dualism and sexism. So some analyses see a little bit of overlap between spiritual practice and a part of the far right. Some other things that we can definitely notice is that esotericists, left-wing and single issue actors, and single issue, I mean, for example, animal rights. We also have animal rights organizations that have started to propagate conspiracy theories, Bill Gates and all sorts of chips and all sorts of other things. And the point is to say that we should really start looking at these groups that we haven't really looked at before, at least not in this context of extremism. What we've also seen is that, for example, with the esotericists, that the new conspiracies they have built a little bit on older ones. The older ones were not necessarily political in nature. So it was more about, you find things about, aliens and planets and things like this, but not necessarily related to everyday politics, really in that spiritual sphere. But the way of building those conspiracies actually helped them, I guess, develop a belief in these new ones, which are more, which have more to do with actual life and the political system itself. We also see some overlaps between these theories and far-right ideas, such as, for example, the conspiratorial narratives about a small group controlling the world. We have that also with the esotericists before. The importance of individual freedom, and in some cases, patriotism. So in some countries, you also see this idea that is part of the spiritual esoteric scene, but of course corresponds very well to the far right. And to conclude, it's really, I think I have 15 minutes left. It's really a matter of understanding how these transitions take place, because the point of the matter is, so far, the far right and the jihadi scenes have been seen and are still a marginal portion of the population. However, these other groups, esotericists and others, and religious groups, they are of course larger. So if these groups are migrating towards extremist thinking, that poses really a very grave danger to societies. And we can already see some correlation, for example, between the vaccination.
Thanks, Daniela. We're at time. Yeah. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm delighted to present our next speaker, Dean Smith from the University of St Andrews, who's going to speak with us about political extremism and conspiracy theories, the case of QAnon. Over to you, Dean.
Thank you very much. I'll just set up my screen share. Okay, can I just confirm that everyone can both see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation. I'm delighted to share my research with you. This research project, entitled Political Extremism and Conspiracy Theories, the Case of QAnon, was carried out by myself, Dean Smith, and my colleague Heidi Davies at the School of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of St Andrews. Now, given the nature of this symposium and the backgrounds of the attendees, I'm not going to go into too much depth in regards to the particularities of the QAnon conspiracy. I'm going to assume that most of you are at least basically familiar with it. In the wake of the Capitol attack on January 6, 2021, a particular ideological aspect of the attackers came into public attention, that being the QAnon conspiracy. A conspiracy theory which had been growing in some form from 2017 and had unfortunately moved from internet forums and extremist websites into the real world with some quite violent results. The relationship between conspiracy theories and political extremism has been of a particular interest for social psychologists like myself for many years now, owing in part to the massive upsurge in the presence of politicized conspiracy theories within the United States following the election of Barack Obama in 2008. Therefore, this research project has been an attempt to bring a social psychological understanding of the QAnon phenomenon. Previous social psychological research done by Dr. Karen Douglas and her colleagues at the University of Kent have outlined 3 major social psychological motivations underpinning conspiratorial thinking. The first being the epistemic motives. This relates to a need for certainty, clarity, and to have access to truth. In particular, confusing times, conspiracy theories can help make sense of discordant information. The second is the existential motives. These relate to the need to feel safe, secure, and unthreatened. And finally, the social motivations. These relate primarily to the desire for both individuals and their particular identity groups to feel that they have status, that they're superior to their particular outgroup, and that fears that their position of superiority may be usurped or made sense of within this context. What's notable is that Douglas et al. Also outlines a major psychological factor present amongst conspiratorial thinking. This factor explains the supposedly contradictory nature of certain conspiratorial beliefs. For example, research involving attitudes towards the death of Osama bin Laden found an interesting contradiction in terms. Support for the conspiratorial belief that bin Laden had been killed before his official date of death in 2011 also positively correlated with the belief that bin Laden was still alive. Conspiracy theorists in this case were holding mutually exclusive beliefs. This apparent contradiction can be explained by an underlying factor, that is the rejection of the mainstream narrative. An initial evaluation of these concepts has found striking similarities with multiple other scales and theories used in social psychology. The epistemic motivations bear a striking similarity to a concept referred to as, and this is the author's term, not mine, pseudo-profound bullshit, which will hereafter be referred to as PPB. The existential and social motivations also appear very similar in concern to the subdomains of the social worldview scale developed by John Duckett and colleagues. This relationship is shown here with the 2 subgroups of the social worldview, its dangerous and competitive components being shown with the lightly related subcomponents of conspiratorial thinking, and with PPB aligned with its epistemic equivalent. I will now explain these a little bit more clearly for those who are not familiar. The social worldview scale developed by John Duckett and colleagues in 2003 measures aspects of the respondent's worldview. The SWV scale is comprised of 2 underlying factors discerned through the use of factor analysis. The first is a dangerous component, and this measures the extent to which the respondent considers their social world to be fraught with danger and threat. The competitive aspect measures the extent to which respondents regard their social environment as being a competitive jungle in which only the ruthless and self-interested can succeed. For clarity's purposes, I will provide a couple of examples in regards to the dangerous worldview. I will read out question number 4 here, which is: my knowledge and experience tells me that the social world we live in is basically a dangerous and unpredictable place in which good, decent and moral people's values and way of life is threatened and disturbed by bad people. And in regards to the competitive worldview, I will read out question number 2. My knowledge and experience tells me that the social world we live in is basically a competitive jungle in which the fittest survive and succeed, in which power, wealth and winning are everything and might is right. PPB was originally developed by Pennycook et al. In 2018. These pseudo-profound statements give the impression of deep meaning, but are utterly devoid of actual content. The original work by Pennycook et al. And later followed up by Nielsen's, whose work that we have extracted the questions from, found that extremist ideologies on both the left and the right were susceptible to PPB. As the ideology became progressively more extreme, the extent to which individuals saw meaning in PPB vastly increased. Given that this concept involves a projection of meaning onto otherwise potentially meaningless stimuli, it is not hard to see how this bears a certain level of similarity with the aforementioned epistemic motivations described by Douglas and colleagues. A few examples of this I've highlighted are: the future elucidates irrational facts for the seeking person. Your movement transforms universal observations, and the invisible is beyond all new immutability. All very profound sounding statements, all utterly meaningless. An area of interest that should not be overlooked in this regard is that how QAnon specifically relates to right-wing political ideology. It has been shown that QAnon has to some extent spread its way into democratic circles within the United States, particularly within the sort of the yoga and alternative medicine influencers on social media. However, it is likely that there is potentially different social identity and social psychological motivations behind these particular areas. As a result, this particular project focused exclusively on the American far right, well, the American right wing more broadly. It was important to be able to differentiate the American political right into subcategories rather than considering it holistically as a single entity. Therefore, by using the political compass test as a guide, we divided the American political right into 5 subsets. These were the ultranationalists, the religious right, the racial implied white supremacists, libertarians, and economic conservatives. So what was our hypothesis here? We had 4 broad hypotheses which, through a survey system, we desired to explore. The first one being that the QAnon belief system will have multiple underlying factors, that there will be a positive relationship between each component of the social worldview scale and whatever these Q factors turn out to be, that there will be some form of relationship between the Q factors and political ideology, the exact nature of which we did not hypothesize beforehand, and that there will be a positive relationship between the Q factors and PPB. This study was carried out via Prolific, a survey distribution system, in early August 2021. The inclusion criteria was limited to individuals who did not vote for the Democratic candidate in 2016. This specific criterion was chosen to cast as wide a net as is possible within the US right wing. A notable part of this research desired to look at the relationship between the QAnon conspiracy and the US political right, not merely the kind of card-carrying, self-identifying Q members. As a result, this seemed like the best way of a base sampling method to gain as wide a respondents we hoped for. It did not exclude individuals who did not necessarily identify explicitly as Republicans. From this criteria, we were able to gain 223 respondents, with 10 being excluded due to incomplete data. The final version of the survey used 5 sets of questions: the QAnon questions, the social worldview questions, PPB, a set of political ideology questions, and a final set of demographic and control questions. The QAnon questions were created from content analysis of Q material pulled from social media and a few journalistic sources. Social worldview was derived from Duckett et al. The ideological questions were pulled from the political compass test, and the pseudo-profound B was pulled from Nielsen et al. In 2018. So what did we find? Our first hypothesis was supported, that there were indeed 2 underlying Q factors. Based on our analysis of the questions which loaded onto each of these factors, we identified the first as a negative attitude towards the outgroup, in particular the Democrats, termed here as Q1, bad Dems. And the second factor was a positive attitude towards Donald Trump, termed here as Q2, good Trump. The distribution for the first factor was more or less what we were expecting. It was a nominally normal distribution with a mean of 3.8, indicating overall that the general negative attitude towards the Democrats was equally distributed amongst our sample. Our second one was more interesting. However, what we found was our particular sample really did not like Donald Trump. Overwhelmingly, I think it was over 80% of the specific sample scored below the central line. In this particular case, the attitude towards Donald Trump as a factor of QAnon was extremely minimal and extremely negative. Our second hypothesis was the relationship between the Q factors and the social worldview. Competitive worldview correlates relatively lowly with both Q factors. However, the dangerous worldview had a moderate correlation with Q2, which was the positive attitude towards Trump, whilst the dangerous worldview correlated relatively highly within this particular scale. A correlation of 0.43 for the dangerous worldview one is actually quite high. This implies that a dangerous worldview is a major driving part of one of the QAnon, well, a large part of the QAnon belief systems, in particular feeling a threat from the outgroup. I have not included the full details of it here due to time constraints, but certain aspects of content analysis which has been done has shown that this is a recurrent issue, particularly a feeling of threat and persecution from the American political left. Hypothesis 3, which were Q factors and ideology. Here I have a correlation matrix, which shows to the extent to which each of the sub-ideological groups correlates with each of the major QAnon factors. I understand that this is not necessarily the most intuitive table. However, when I present it like this, we realise that the main identitarian ideologies, those that have a high social identity content, the ultranationalists, the white supremacists, and the religious right, correlate relatively highly with both QAnon factors, which is not surprising considering the nature of the QAnon content of their beliefs derives elements of ultranationalism, racial supremacy, and quasi-religious symbolism. As we can see, there are three broad ideological clusters. The economic conservatives, on the other hand, are correlating very lowly with the Q factors, and the libertarian group is interesting but not surprising, since its ideology is characterised by the rejection of authoritarian government and conventional political norms. Libertarianism correlated extremely negatively with QAnon. What should be noted at this point is that when we did the analysis of our overall sample, we found that the ideologies of the sample that we looked at skewed disproportionately towards economic conservatives and libertarians. There was a very low correlation between Q factors and PPB. This is likely due to the dilution of our sample. The normal distribution of the first factor and the negative skew of the second indicate that our sample was not particularly conspiratorially inclined. As stated beforehand, we did not actively seek out card-carrying, self-identifying Q members. We desired to look at the American political right more holistically. It's not really much of a surprise then that a scale related to conspiratorial thinking would have a low correlation with a sample with few true conspiracy theorists within it. The implications of this data are quite interesting. First of all, the Q factors are split into two subgroups, relating one part to a general negative view of the outgroup and the other to a positive aspect of the perceived leader. The first being normally distributed suggests that any aspect of right-wing identitarianism, Q being no exception to this, will have a fundamentally negative regard towards their outgroup, in this case the Democrats. This very much ties in with what we understand about social identity theory and self-categorization. The second factor, particularly regarding how skewed it appears in our data, suggests that, at least within our sample, those who have an overwhelmingly positive view of Donald Trump are very much in the minority. What we may be looking at here is that certain aspects of Q factors are more related to right-wing identitarianism than the cult of personality of any one particular leader. However, it should be mentioned that there are certain limitations on our particular data elements, is that Trump fanatics in this particular case simply may not answer a lot of surveys on prolific. In terms of the dangerous and competitive worldview, it is clear that the dangerous view of it is highly correlated with outgroup negativity. This ties in with similar research done on threat perception amongst identitarian groups. A reasonable content analysis of this was a recent documentary aspect put out by the, I don't want to say infamous, Tucker Carlson, in which he speculates that January 6th was in fact a false flag attack carried out by the US Democrats for the purposes of rounding up American right-wingers and putting them in Guantanamo Bay. An extremist statement, of course, but it does elucidate the idea of extreme threat perception within elements of the US political right. Ideological clusters are of interest as it helps explain large aspects of the quasi-religious, racial supremacist and ultranationalist elements of the QAnon belief system and where they originate from, as well as why it appears to these specific groups in the first place. And finally, as stated, the poor correlation with PPB was unexpected. However, reasons for this low correlation are not to be assumed and may simply be a factor of our sampling bias. Finally, directions for future research. Firstly, the role of polarization and potential bimodality within our samples should be investigated. This is particularly interesting because although the sample we did use in regards to the Q factor 2, a positive attitude towards Donald Trump, was very much skewed towards the negative, there were a number of outliers within the sample, and future research should investigate whether this is an overwhelmingly negative or whether there is in fact two normal distributions hidden within the data. Future research could also validate findings by further selecting explicit QAnon supporters. one of the reasons we did not do this was it would be difficult to codify numerically when someone is a true QAnon supporter and when they're not. There's issues with both self-identification criteria and using a particular scale system similar to what we used here. The point at which an individual is classified as a sort of a Q true believer, so to speak, someone who truly trusts the plan, is a fundamentally arbitrary line. And finally, it would be interesting to advance qualitative approaches to this, particular structured or semi-structured interviews with individuals who self-identify as QAnon conspiracists, or at least supporters for that matter, for the purposes of validating our interpretation of this data along with their self-described perspectives. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. This brings me to the end.
Thank you so much, Dean, for a wonderful presentation. Really fascinating, and thanks for keeping to time. We've now got some time for questions, and I'm sure there are going to be lots of really interesting conversations resulting from this research. We've got a question for the first presenters. So Bettina and Paul, did you examine any models, including second-order interactions between the moderating variables? If so, what did you see?
We actually did look at that, and so we looked whether the individual differences of self-control, self-efficacy, if they were further conditioned or dependent, whether participants were like female or male or identified as female or male, and we also looked whether there were any age differences. And so we saw, when we looked at kind of like a three-way interaction where we had like two moderators, we could see that the relationship between conspiracy beliefs and violent extremism, violent extremist intention, and self-efficacy is further conditioned by age. So it means that this effect, which I've earlier presented, was stronger for younger individuals. We could also see that exposure to extremist peers was also stronger, the relationship, the effect size for younger individuals, and the same with delinquency. So whether people, peer delinquency, so we saw that it was stronger for younger individuals. And generally, we only found that conspiracy, the relationship between conspiracy beliefs by age.
Sorry, your sound was just cutting out a little bit there. Would you mind repeating that, please?
Yeah, so we just saw that the relationship between conspiracy beliefs, just the one-way interaction, and violent extremist intentions, was stronger for younger individuals. Yeah, that's what we tested. And it's been published. Yeah, parts of it are published. So the first study is published, isn't published yet.
Great, thanks. Another question for Bettina and Paul. The role of stronger self-efficacy in study 1 for effects of conspiracy beliefs makes good sense at one level, but it is confounding on another because of the role of self-efficacy in individual resilience. Where or how does individual level resilience matter in this context? And does self-efficacy actually become a vulnerability rather than a protective factor here?
Yeah, I can take this, Bettina, if you want. Yeah, so I think with most factors, it depends on sort of what part of the kind of path they're on. That the same factor can play a protective role or a risk role at different sort of stages in the sort of path to actually conducting violent extremism. So I'd say, if you're in that really, really early upstream prevention efforts, building somebody's self-efficacy before it sort of goes down into a worse path is a good idea. But I think, for somebody to then become a terrorist, they also need a lot of self-efficacy because they need to sort of believe that they're going to be able to try and change the world, avoid the sort of attention of counterterrorism police and intelligence. So the sort of further downstream it gets and the closer to violence, building self-efficacy might actually have the opposite effect of what you're trying to hope will happen. So a part of that sort of threat assessment and your sort of management of an individual depends on where you're placing them on their path to violent extremism, and then also the sort of constellation of other features that are around them. So sometimes it might be, you know, and it sort of slightly depends on what sort of motivation brought them into violent extremism, and whether you can sort of divert them into other activities that require that sort of self-efficacy. So it's a classic academic answer of it depends.
Thank you. We have another question which would be applicable to all of you really, but I'll ask it to our second two speakers. So this is a question regarding the relationship between the far-right movement and the anti-vax movement. Do you have any thoughts as to how to address this to encourage the vaccination uptake?
Should I go first? Okay, I'm just going to go first. So yeah, I mean, it depends. Again, what we've seen, for example, is that deplatforming doesn't work very well. So there's been some, you know, Facebook banning accounts that spread disinformation. And there's also been, for example, government initiatives in some countries to ban certain websites and blogs and such. But it hasn't worked really well. I mean, you can see that it hasn't really affected the number of people who believe in these things. And there's, of course, always a way to do it in a different manner, you know, to maintain your presence online just differently. I think what one needs to do is really to engage with the narratives and try, because, of course, it's difficult because the narratives are very consistent in how they argue. But also they use so-called empirical evidence. So they come up with doctors and, you know, like people with authority. So all the kinds of resonance criteria that we know work, for example, in social movements. So what you need to do is you basically need to start your own campaign and clarify these things for people. And I haven't really seen this being done much. Now, the problem is, and I'm finishing with this point, the problem is that everything is more difficult if you have far-right parties in the government. Yeah, so that makes it really, because, for example, to give you an example, in Denmark, there's a really high rate of vaccination, but there the far-right party was very restrained in their views. So they basically went along with the main government policy. Whereas in other countries, such as here, you have a far-right party who is very, I mean, you have the leader showing off by him not being vaccinated. He presented a test to show that he is not vaccinated. So, you know, and this is a mainstream major political actor. So, you know, it has credibility, and that's really difficult to convince people in that case.
Thanks, Daniela. Dean, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add, or Bettina or Paul?
Yeah, just it's been an interesting aspect of over the last kind of 18 months is this kind of new association with a kind of anti-vax movement, particularly in a politicized form. We've seen it in quite stark contrast within the US, but it's obviously filtered out to various other nations as well. One previous paper, it wasn't done specifically with in regards to vaccines, it was conspiratorial papers more broadly, did find that, ironic to use this terminology, that it is possible to vaccinate people against certain conspiracy theories, but it requires you giving them a critical approach, a critical evaluation of the conspiracy before they're actually exposed to the propaganda. If it happens the other way around, then they just interpret the critical approach within the context of the conspiracy. It's one of the reasons why the sort of like the mass social media banning of disinformation hasn't been particularly successful. It seems to have just forced ours into sort of alternate social media platforms, places like Parler, because it seems to just confirm their underlying worldview, that they know the truth, that whoever they are actively trying to silence them because they are correct. Therefore, rather than silencing their worldview or removing disinformation, it causes them to double down.
Thanks. We've had some similar experiences to the ones that Daniela was mentioning in the Australian context with elected members for Parliament, actually sending SMS messages to huge numbers of Australians with a list of vaccine adverse effects. So that contributes to the misinformation and disinformation environment that we're in very unhelpfully. I might ask whether the presenters have questions for each other, would you like to raise some questions of other presenters?
Yes, I want to say something to Bettina and Paul. I had to think when, about self-efficacy. Because so there are some approaches saying that, you know, people radicalize because they have a low self-efficacy, and then, you know, whilst radicalizing, they get it back. So it becomes so. I was thinking whether, you know, maybe this time element plays a role in the whole context, saying like, you know, if they're already radicalized, of course they're going to have a high self-efficacy, but because they're already radicalized, right? Not because they would have had it otherwise. So that was just a thought.
Yeah, definitely. Just the sort of the nature of the kind of data here is cross-sectional, so we can't do it as a part of that analysis. I mean, we've done that sort of time sequencing activities before, either looking at sort of autobiographical accounts or closed source data. And yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you find that these effects that are often treated as risk or protective factors actually occur post-radicalization, right? So like recent paper with Emily showed, you know, sort of psychological distress and mental health problems that kick in once they're a part of a group and living on the run and the stress of involved in it. So it's just a matter of sort of choosing the right kind of data sources to be able to sort of unpick all of these things. But often, you know, as part of our research program, you know, a cross-sectional analysis will kick up a question like that, which then we'll have to analyze with a different form of data to try and get sort of answer on it. And we're looking to sort of do you know, sort of sequenced surveys. So we go back to the same pool of people over time to sort of see fluctuations in their different sort of risk protective factors and the outcome variables. So, but I mean, it's just, you know, they're chunky, financially difficult parts of work that we just haven't found a funding mechanism for. But yeah, I absolutely agree. We just don't have the right data in front of us. It's definitely one potential.
Any more questions from our presenters for each other? I think we might draw the session to a close, and thank you all very much for fascinating presentations, and look forward to reading more of your work in this space, this really exciting and troubling space that we're increasingly needing to grapple with. And I pass it on to the convener of the Research Network, Professor Michelle Grossman, to close our conference. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. We're actually going to begin with some closing remarks from our Department of Home Affairs colleague and sponsor, Dr. John Chunky. So I might hand over to John first.
Yes, thank you, Vivian, and thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, my name's John Chunky, and I'm the Acting Director of CVE Intervention within the CVE branch of the Australian Department of Home Affairs. And I'm going to make some closing observations on behalf of the department before handing back to Michelle to sum up and close the conference. So the Department of Home Affairs funded this conference because the work being conducted by violent extremism researchers such as yourselves is so vital to building our understanding of violent extremism and how best to respond. It's been really exciting over the last few days to engage with the enormous diversity and disciplines involved in the research that has been presented. And we've certainly attracted some of the world's most accomplished people in the field. But I also want to acknowledge the early career researchers who gave presentations at this conference. Witnessing their passion for this field is so encouraging, and I think it augurs really well for the future of CVE studies. I've also been struck by how much work is being done into the proliferation of nationalist and racist violent extremist and conspiracy-fueled networks in the online and offline environments. And this reminds me how important it is that government agencies such as Home Affairs build and maintain close relationships with the research community if we're to remain abreast of emerging phenomena. And to this end, we're delighted to be able to fund the AVERT network led by Michelle and Lydia, and which has hosted this conference. In the last few months, AVERT has organised 2 conferences, arranged research projects, and will shortly commission a further series of research projects on our behalf. This is a research relationship that we're very excited about, and we look forward to a long and productive relationship. course, the task facing my colleagues and me now is to consider how we can support the translation of your research findings into guidance and practice for our CVE and CT community. And in this regard, I'm very pleased that Michelle and Lydia will be organising a series of seminars with a focus on inviting CVE and CT practitioners to engage with the work presented over the last 3 days and consider its implications for policy and practice. And I think this was going to really extend the impact of the research that you've shared with us over the last 3 days. So I want to congratulate you for the hard work that goes into participating in a 3-day conference as presenter and delegate, including all of you who live in opposite time zones to ours. Online conferences can create difficulties, relationship building and networking, but they do bring the advantage of convening international participation. And we're all the better for that. I want to assure you that the work undertaken over the last 3 days presents a tangible and enduring investment in our social cohesion and national security, and I thank you for it. And finally, I want to acknowledge the enormous amount of work that the organising committee, and in particular Michelle Grossman, Lydia Khalil, and Ben Freeman from Deakin, and Andrew Wright from my team, have put into making this conference such a success. So I look forward to meeting you in person when we hold our next CVE symposium, hopefully face-to-face next year. So thank you again, and over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, John, both for your closing remarks on behalf of Home Affairs and also for the wonderful support that we've had from the department in not only sponsoring, but also engaging so actively with the papers, panels, and speakers that we've had online over the last 3 days. Now, I think Ben is just going to pop a cartoon up on the screen for a moment while I'm speaking. Thanks, Ben. I was reminded at various points during this conference of the old Larson cartoon, which you can now see in front of you, in which a hapless student seeks release from the classroom because his brain is well and truly full. My own brain is pretty overstuffed with the wealth of insights, analyses, questions, and provocations that have been offered by so many rich and exciting presentations and discussions as the conference program has unfolded. And Ben, we should probably, to avoid any copyright issues, take the cartoon down now. Thank you. One of the key aims of this year's AVERT Research Symposium has been to explore the ways in which violent extremism and our approaches to preventing the take-up and mitigating the impact of violent extremism and terrorism are now at something of a crossroads, and what this might mean for the future. In this sense, I think the work that we've heard presented across the symposium has very significantly overachieved, offering us really vital, critical perspectives on crossroads and also intersections of various kinds, between inspired versus strategic terrorism, as Martha Crenshaw explored so thoughtfully in her keynote, between violent versus non-violent extremist trajectories, between different definitions and conceptions of extremism, between community-specific versus mainstreaming, PCVE programming and policy, between conspiracy and terrorism, and also hate and violent extremism, and of course between digital and spatial economies of terrorist sociality, communication, and action, but also crossroads and intersections between different disciplines and what they can learn from each other, as Maura Conway's keynote also made so bracingly clear, and that is just a small sample. We also learned a great deal about the ways in which our methodologies in terrorism studies are at a crossroads, with one of the strong themes of the conference emerging as a concern to move away from more binary frameworks that pose our theoretical and practical responses as either or propositions, and instead focus on developing more integrated both and models that work with complex actors, influences, dynamics, and environments, as well as the crossroads of how we might usefully incorporate digital methodologies into our research toolkits in routine rather than exceptional ways. And all this in a sociocultural ecosystem in which our efforts to develop new knowledge and to operationalize that knowledge face the formidable challenge of highly unstable information integrity in a post-truth environment marked by the rise of mis- and disinformation and political polarization. And these are some of the forces that are creating what I would call a dark dynamism, not only for the growth of violent extremist ideologies, but also for how we're able to respond effectively and operate within the context of these forces. Another theme that appeared as either foreground or background in a number of presentations focused on a shift that those of us whose research on terrorism is informed by our origins in cultural and communication studies have been noting for some time. And this is the transition we're making from a text-based to a visual or image-based paradigm of communication. Now, one of our US presenters, Rick Legault, compared this to the disruption created by the introduction of the printing press in the Middle Ages. And indeed, we know from scholarship on the relationship between transition from orality to literacy at that time, for example, that these paradigm shifts literally rewire our consciousness in terms of how we process information and manage the production of knowledge. We can see some of this in the way around this transition into visual and image-based culture. We see this in the way in which regimes of meme and emoji communication models have taken hold, but also the ways in which political advertising and commercial marketing have embraced visual and multimodal communication strategies were already long their province, but now in ways specifically adapted to digital environments. And so for terrorism studies, which has to be concerned with these things as well, this is one of the new frontiers for how we develop and apply solutions to some of the challenges that we face in strategic communications that seek to provide alternatives that influence, disrupt, or divert people immersed in violent extremist narrative, image, meaning making, and ultimately action. And I'm excited to see how some of the brilliant minds that we've been privileged to interact with over the last few days will be tackling this horizon. All of this is to say that if this year's symposium is anything to go by, both of terrorism studies as a field remains robust and contested, which is also always a sign of health. An appetite for creating genuinely new knowledge and for risk and innovation in both the questions that we ask and the methodologies we bring to bear on these was consistently on display. And I think that augurs really well for the future. It remains for me to remind us once again that conferences are not put together by fairies and elves, and to thank the many people who have made the online AVERT Symposium a reality and a success in 2021. I noted in my opening remarks, the conference has been made possible by a generous funding grant from the Department of Home Affairs, who have also been wonderful contributors to the shape and format of the conference through their participation on our organizing committee, as well as taking on the role of session sharing at various points. And we're really grateful for their sustained engagement and belief in AVERT as a research network. Lydia Khalil, our AVERT coordinator. Now, I had a section of extravagant encomia for the remarkable Lydia, but she told me I'm not allowed to say it. So let me just say instead what everybody already knows, that Lydia is possessed of equal gifts in the intellectual, logistical, organizational, and collegial contributions that she's made to bringing this conference to fruition, and that she has my eternal gratitude and esteem for that. The same may be said for the man I call the wizard, Ben Freeman, our technical support officer, who's exhibited consistent grace under equally consistent pressure, and who's been responsible for making the Zoom experience of moving between sessions and speakers for 11 hours a day over the last few days such a smooth and seamless online endeavor for participants. Amongst his many other talents, Ben also created the design and format for the conference call for papers and the program featuring the new AVERT branding that's shortly going to appear on our website. The conference theme, focus, and the happy process of sifting through so many excellent abstracts and proposals in response to our CFP were designed and managed by an outstanding conference organizing committee, including, and this is in alphabetical order, John Chunky, Natalie Davis, Lydia Khalil, David Curnow, Aftab Malik, Natalie Pisoiu, Deborah Smith, Lise Waldeck, Andrew Wright, and myself. Our warmest thanks to these colleagues for helping develop such a vibrant conference call that resulted in the outstanding presentations that we've had right across the symposium. And a really special shout out to Andrew Wright from the Department of Home Affairs, who served as the department's symposium liaison and did an enormous amount of highly adept legwork behind the scenes to ensure that all the organizational and logistical pieces of the symposium jigsaw from the government end fell into the right place at the right time. And I'd also like to thank all the session chairs who did a really great job of ensuring that we stayed to time on our schedule, and also for making each Q&A session such an engaging feature of the online format. And another special thanks to Greg Barton at Deakin University, who fired off an astonishing number of stylish and information-packed tweets throughout the conference on behalf of AVERT that helped bring a taste of what presentations were covering to the broader audience of AVERT followers online. My final thanks, of course, goes to all of you, the symposium participants. You've engaged, responded, challenged, got up too early and stayed up too late, and you've kept these sessions real with the questions that you've asked, which have sparked such interesting and generative discussions amongst panel members during each session's Q&A. My colleague, John Chunky, has reminded me that the word symposium derives from ancient Greek and originally meant drinking party. Well, if only. I dearly wish that we'd all been in the same room so we could have had a laugh, a natter, and a drink together in the usual in-between spaces that face-to-face conferences traditionally offer. But let's hope, as John said earlier, that we get to do exactly that when the next symposium for AVERT happens in 2022. So with that, on behalf of the AVERT team, we bid you a good morning, or day, or night, wherever you are. Thank you for being part of the 2021 symposium, and hope that you continue to stay in touch with us at AVERT and with the colleagues whose work you've connected with over the last few days. We'll be in touch shortly about accessing the recordings of conference presentations in the coming days and weeks, but in the meantime, stay well, and we hope to see you again before too long. All the best.